Have you ever encountered slime mold before? It's that stuff that can grow in your walls when there's water damage that you weren't expecting. Best case scenario, that slime mold is going to be an annoyance that you have to get rid of. Worst case scenario, you have to abandon your house. But Toshiyuki Nakagaki, a professor at Hokkaido University in Sapporo, Japan, he studies slime mold for a living. He spent his entire career working on it. And he came up with an experiment that defies logic and reason. So slime mold has this interesting property that as it spreads and it encounters multiple food sources, it'll create tunnels to be able to more efficiently distribute that nutrients. So what Nakagaki did was he took little pieces of oat flakes, which are really rich sources of nutrients for slime mold, and he placed it in the same pattern as the railway stations in the Tokyo transit system. So initially what happens is the slime mold, it spreads indiscriminately. And then as it hits those little oats, it starts to form tunnels. Well, Nakagaki, he takes a picture when it's all done and he overlays that picture on top of the Tokyo railway system. And what he finds is that they're nearly identical. In other words, this slime mold, which has no brain and no nervous system, in a 24-hour period, was able to mimic the efforts of thousands of brilliant engineers who would develop a transit system to ferry millions of people to multiple intersecting points. Isn't it interesting that an organism that generally elicits revulsion from most people is capable of such engineering feats? And what I love so much about this experiment is that it exposes a hidden beauty about the world. What Nakagaki did was he showed that this little eukaryotic organism, it has a complex cellular intelligence. And so the question I asked myself is, where did he come up with this? Like, where did he get this idea from? And the answer is, he was curious. One day he was looking at a map of the Tokyo transit system and he thought to himself, what if I just place those oats in the general vicinity? How will the slime mold create those tunnels? What will it look like? Now, normally, you wouldn't combine these two fields. You wouldn't combine slime mold with the Tokyo transit system. These are two things you'd never put together. But in doing so, it revealed this incredible beauty about the world that otherwise we would have never known about had he not been curious. And this is what I want to talk about today. How curiosity can open our minds to entirely new ways of looking at the world. I want to talk about how we can inspire curiosity, why curiosity is necessary for a fulfilling life, and why curiosity often is squashed out of us when we're children. So to begin, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine who has made some incredible discoveries about the world because she was curious. Come and join me in the kitchen. So I want to welcome Dr. Cecile Chazot to Kokoro. Thank you for being here today with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
The way we do this segment on Kokoro, the way we generally start, is that I make a meal that corresponds with the theme of what we're talking about.
Okay.
And because today's theme is curiosity, I started this by talking about a professor over in Japan who had figured out a way to make slime mold create tunnels in the form of the Tokyo transit system. And he used oats to do that because slime mold likes oats. So I thought that what I would make for us is some oatmeal that we could eat. Let's give it a try. And then we're going to dive into what you do because I think what you do is so fascinating. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds really great.
By the way, I am no professional chef. That's kind of one of the jokes of this
whole series is that I'm not. Actually, that came out okay.
That's pretty good, actually.
That's not too bad. So tell me a little bit about yourself, because I think you have a fascinating story. Tell me how you got into studying science.
Okay. Well, so it's not really like, I feel like a lot of kids are like, oh, I always wanted to do science. Not really. I mostly started just because I like building stuff. And I mostly did crafting as a kid. I really liked doing things with my hands, and I'm making jewelry and like knit and sew and all that stuff. When it was time to pick what I wanted to do in high school, my mom brought me to the open houses of a bunch of high school. And there was this technical high school that did a lot of mechanical design and electrical work. And I visited and I was like, this is so sick. This is like crafting, but with metals and electronic circuits and all of this. And I was like, and they're like, this is what engineering is.
I think it's really interesting. You end up getting into MIT over here in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Will you talk a little bit about kind of what you ended up doing over here at MIT?
I got into this exchange program to do research at MIT. And I really wanted to continue doing robotics and engineering. And there's this professor who contacts me and says, I do bio-inspired colors. I do colors inspired by natural systems. Do you want to work in my lab? And I was like, it's no classes. I'll just do anything. And so I got into his lab and I really caught the fever of research, where we started working on how colors emerge from butterfly wings and from certain structures that are like at the nanoscale, which is about 1,000 times smaller than a human hair, and how those structures interact with light to create iridescent colors on butterfly wings.
Now, I think what's so interesting about what you do is that you've taken all of these different fields and you've combined them together. And so talk a little bit about when you came to Northwestern, because you developed a very unique method for creating textiles. And maybe you can talk about the problem with textiles and what it is you were trying to solve.
Yeah, so the big problem with textiles is the environmental impact and also the human impact. So if you look at the history of the textile industry, textiles have never been good for the environment, and most textile workers, who are for the large majority female too, have to work in horrible conditions. And just for textile dyeing, for instance, it's currently responsible of about 20% of water pollution worldwide. All of this because people are craving beautiful colors. If dyes are so horrible, can we just get colors without using dyes? And the answer is yes, because nature does it. Those butterfly wings that I'm talking about, a lot of times they don't rely on pigments. They don't rely on dyes. They rely on this periodic nanoscale arrangement. So what we work on in my lab is to try to reproduce this with natural materials, such as cellulose, which is what makes up cotton and different plants, but also with other materials that are derived from crab shells, that are derived from fungi, and all those natural materials that are just generally very abundant. And how can we get those materials to assemble in those periodic structures that can then create colors without you having to dye the material?
So talk a little bit about how your curiosity in these various areas, how it has led you to create this textile lab here at Northwestern.
Being in academia, we don't necessarily always see what is closer to the consumer and to the large scales we're talking about, which is industry. So I went and worked in an industry for a year. I worked in a French glass company at a school Saint-Gobain. I was like, wow, this is actually a complete different way of thinking. I'm really interested in trying to bring together the scientific question, how does nature does it, how do the colors appear, to, okay, this is great, we solve those, but with the grand goal of figuring out large scale and translation to actual consumer products. And bringing together all those different knowledge takes this openness to be guided by curiosity and ask oneself a question and be like, what if, or what is it that I would like to know, and go and do it and go and explore it, so that we can potentially bring together aspects that are not necessarily entirely related. And sometimes I tell my students, they think a lot, they say, I read all those papers, I don't know if this is gonna work, I think this is not gonna work, and I'm like, just go in the lab and try it. Don't put yourself in danger.
Yeah, right.
But like, put a protocol together, go in the lab, try it, because the only way we're actually gonna know which way it's gonna go, or we're gonna get a better idea of where we're going, is if we actually go in the lab and try it.
Well, Cecile, thank you for coming and being here with us today. I think what you do is absolutely fascinating. And keep being curious about the world, because thanks to you, I feel like in the future we can actually sit there and say, textiles are not polluting the planet and they're not destroying our water system. So thank you for doing what you do.
And they would look gorgeous.
And I guarantee you they will. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
The first two paintings that Leonardo da Vinci ever did on his own was Madonna with Flower, painted in 1478, and Madonna of the Carnation, painted in 1480. Both of these paintings portray the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus. Now, this particular painting had been done many, many times before. He wasn't the first artist to do it. What made Leonardo da Vinci's painting unique was that he didn't concoct a baby from his own mind. He actually studied his own stepbrothers. So his father had recently become married, and they had had two baby boys, his stepbrothers. And so in his notebook, we actually have sketches of these little babies that he took. These observations translated into Leonardo's baby Jesus possessing these fluid and realistic motions with his face, hands, and body. In other words, Leonardo's baby Jesus looked and acted like a real baby, and nobody had ever done that before. What Leonardo had managed to do is that he captured a deep psychology within his portraits, kind of like a photographic snapshot. Leonardo's paintings managed to convey people in the midst of movement and thought. And these would reach their zenith in some of his most famous works, like The Last Supper, which he painted in 1495, Salvator Mundi, which he painted in 1500, and the Mona Lisa, which he painted in 1504. What allowed his art to improve almost exponentially was his natural curiosity about the world. He had an insatiable appetite for learning. So, for instance, Leonardo ended up dissecting more than 30 cadavers to better understand the musculature and the movements of his subjects. He studied the physics of light refraction so that he'd understand how light bounced off of various objects. I mean, you can see this in some of his paintings, particularly the Mona Lisa, where he's using light in a very particular kind of way. He studied the chemical interactions of various substrates so that he could get better paint saturations and varieties with his colors. His experimental approach to these subjects have led many historians to label Leonardo as being one of the first true scientists. He's the first modern scientist. As Leonardo's curiosity led him to a greater understanding of the world, the quality of his art improved. In fact, his multidisciplinary approach to his art is very similar to Toshiyuki Nakagaki, the way that he combined slime mold with the Tokyo transit system. When we're curious and we take different areas of knowledge and combine them together, it reveals unexpected beauty. And in my opinion, it's unexpected beauty that makes life worth living. And to explore this more, I want to go upstairs, but before I do, I'm going to finish my painting, and then I'll meet you up there. I think children are curious by nature. Most children, if you let them, I think they would do whatever they could to get their hands on as much of the world as possible so they could learn as much as they could. I think it's in our DNA to want to understand our surroundings. But somewhere along the way, that curiosity ends up getting completely cut out of us. And personally, I blame adults for that. I have vivid memories of being a child and adults saying to me, "That's a stupid question. Why would you even ask that?" And our education system doesn't exactly help either. Adults take learning which should be fun and the ultimate expression of curiosity, and turn learning into a chore. So that by the time most people are teenagers and graduating from high school, their curiosity has all been but snuffed out of them. Now, to me, that's incredibly sad, because one of the most tragic consequences of a lack of curiosity is not ignorance, but an inability to be surprised. I love it when my curiosity surprises me, when I learn something new. I love it even more when I learn something and it surprises me so much that I have to completely change my perspective. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. I remember when my sons were young, like preschool age. We were driving around in a car and we started talking about when they were born. And so we're trying to answer these questions in ways that they can understand, because they're asking about things like, where do babies come from? And then in the midst of this conversation, my older son asks, where were we before we were born? And I thought about this while we were driving, and I realized that I didn't have a good answer to that question. And so I turned it around and I asked him that same question. I said, well, what do you think? Where were we before we were born? And he thinks for a second and he says, we are wind before we are born. I love that answer. And I thought it was so beautiful and so wise. And in all my time thinking about issues of life and death and the soul, I would have never come up with an answer like that. In fact, I liked it better than all of the other answers I personally had come up with. I think a lot of adults would sit there and think to themselves, what does a 5-year-old know about life and death? Well, more than we realize if we just ask. And this is why it's so important that we cultivate curiosity in our lives. Because curiosity leads to learning. And learning is what opens our minds to these small details that we might have otherwise missed. And it's within those small details that we discover beauty. And for me, when I'm feeling depressed or lonely or lost, engaging my curiosity has helped me find my way back to that beauty in the world. And that has shaken me back into myself. And all it takes is just a small shift, and the world can become an entirely different place. So no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, no matter how you feel, please know that you are loved, you are seen, and you are cared for, if by no one else, by me. My name is Alex Lang, and until next time.